Good evening. Hatsagwinzi Shilakat. Good evening, friends. My name is Elaine Alexi. I am the Northern Community Engagement Officer in the Faculty of Native Studies. I am pleased to present this evening our guest speaker from the Northwest Territories, Amos. As part of our Northern Conversation series, a lot of times on campus, when we have Northern events, focus events, we always like to include people from the North to come down and speak on Northern matters. So just a quick introduction about Amy. I'm very pleased and happy that she was able to join us and to present on research priorities in the Gwich'in Settlement Area. It's not often that we're able to get Amy here, so I'm very happy to have her. Amy is a Nita Gwich'in participant of the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement. She was born in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, and raised in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she completed a Bachelor of Science degree in biology at Mount St. Vincent University in 2004. She researched shellfish for Fisheries and Oceans Canada between 2000 and 2005. In January 2006, she moved back to Inuvik to work as a biologist for the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board. The co-management board is responsible for wildlife, fish, and forest management in the Gwich'in Settlement Area. In March 2009, she accepted the position of Executive Director with the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board, and she supervises between 5 to 7 staff and implements Section 12 and 13 of the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement. So welcome me and joining Amy to the University of Alberta.
Thank you, Elaine, for the warm welcome. And I am happy that I was able to come and give a talk this afternoon or this evening. I am on my way to Winnipeg to meet with Fisheries and Oceans tomorrow, and we were just able to coordinate and make this happen. So I hope you enjoy my talk. Before I get into the presentation, Elaine did give an introduction, but I've always been told by my elders that it's important to just give a little bit of context of who I am before beginning to give a presentation. So as mentioned, I am Gwich'in. I was born in Inuvik. My mom's side is Gwich'in and my dad is non-Indigenous and mostly Scottish. He has a mixture of a lot of different backgrounds, but mostly Scottish. And I was raised with him in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then I moved back to Inuvik almost 12 years ago. So this evening, my presentation, I'll give an introduction, a bit of context setting on the Gwich'in and the land claim, and then I'll go into the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board's mandate, and then how they have a research priority setting process. And then I'll end with some best practices with some examples for people that are interested in doing research in the North, and end with a summary. So for introduction, I should note that all the pictures that are in this presentation are from our office. And you can get a bit of an understanding of the type of work that we do and the landscape in the Gwich'in Settlement Area. So my goal, I feel pretty passionately about trying to encourage research that is connected to community interests, and I do try to communicate that with researchers. And so hopefully my talk is, I could talk about a lot of different things. I tried to focus it on these elements. So my goal is to encourage more research that's meaningful in the communities. And what I hope to explain to you in the presentation this evening is ways that I see that we can bridge the gap between researchers and the community and be the voice for communities with respect to research and their interests, and how to inform researchers of existing processes that they could tie into. And at the end of the presentation, I'll come back to this to hopefully I've achieved that. So to give you a bit of information on the Gwich'in. So we are the most northernly Indigenous people in the North American continent. living at the northwestern limits of the boreal forest, and only the Inuit live further than us. We're part of the larger family of Indigenous people called the Athabascans, but our language and way of life is distinct. And at the time of contact with Euro-Canadians, we lived in 9 different bands with land stretching. We followed the villages that were set up traditionally followed the migration path of the porcupine caribou, and our people are really tied to the porcupine caribou, and you'll see traditional villages within the Northwest Territories, Yukon, and Alaska. But within the Northwest Territories, we have 4 communities, Inuvik, Aklavik, Fort McPherson, and Sigachik, and within those communities, the population is around 3,400 people. We do still maintain close cultural and family ties with our Gwich'in relatives in the Yukon and Alaska, and together we total over 6,000 people in 15 communities. Many families still maintain summer and winter camps outside of our communities, and hunting, fishing, and trapping still remain an important part both culturally and economically, with caribou, moose, and whitefish being the staples of our diet. And this picture is of our office manager that works for the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board in some of our traditional clothing. So so in September we held a workshop in Aklavik, and one of our Gwich'in participants said this statement, and it really resonated with me, and I think that it's important to always keep in the back of our mind that our people are natural conservationists, and in the past they've always known how to manage the resources themselves. So if one species had less, if they're observing less of one species, they would switch and start harvesting a different species to help the populations manage themselves. And I've been told that the chief or leaders at the time would hold gatherings and talk to people about this as well, and people would listen. So I think this is important to remember and keep in the back of our minds as we look at modern land claim management processes and think about how our people have always been involved in monitoring the land and its resources. So in 1992, the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement was signed. I was 10 living in Halifax. But our land claim includes a lot of different topics, but the one I'm going to talk to you today is the management of natural resources. But to give you an idea of the different types of topics covered in our land claim, I won't go into the other areas, but it does talk about Gwich'in-owned lands, economic benefits, land environmental management, which includes renewable resources management, Chapter 12 and 13, as well as hunting and fishing rights and the option to negotiate self-government. So the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board, I'll get into that. This picture was from our workshop that we had in Aklavik in September. And it includes our board members in the back and our staff in the front. So the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board was established under the guidance of the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement to be the main instrument for wildlife, fish, and forest management within the Gwich'in Settlement Area. And like mentioned before, this relates to Chapter 12 and 13 of our land claim, and everything the board does help implement these chapters of our land claim. On the map in green is the Gwich'in Settlement Area, and the 4 communities I mentioned before, Inuvik, Aklavik, Sigachik, and Fort McPherson are on that map. I think it's important to mention that the board is the regional structure, but in each of the communities we have renewable resources councils, and they have a mandate to manage at the local level. And I guess just to give you a little bit of context, the Aklavik has a population of around 600 or 700 people. There are 2 land claims that share that community, the Gwich'in and the Inuvialuit. And Fort McPherson is predominantly Gwich'in. The population is around 800. And Inuvik is a mixed community. It was established as the main administrative center for the Western Arctic, and I believe it's the largest community above the Arctic Circle. It also shares not just Gwich'in and Inuvialuit, there's a lot of different cultures in Inuvik. And Sikachik is small. It's around 150 or so people, and it's located on the confluence of the Arctic Red River and the Mackenzie River, and a lot of the people rely on predominantly fish in that community. The point I want to emphasize with the Renewable Resources Council is that we do consider them the eyes and ears on the land. The board does look to them for advice on all of the work they do, including relying on them to identify research interests at the community level. So just to tie it back, the GRRB works very closely with the RRCs. The board holds 2 meetings face-to-face, and they rotate those meetings in the communities, and the staff are actively in the communities. Usually we try to set a goal of each staff to be attending at least 2 RRC meetings per community per year. So that's 8 meetings, and they hold monthly meetings. So we're actively, between the 6 staff, always trying to be at these meetings and working, even just making a presence and listening to what people want to have done. So the board is structured. It's in a co-management structure. We have a chairperson nominated by the board that has to be a resident of the Gwich'in Settlement Area. Eugene Pascal is our chair, and he's from Aklavik. Then we have 6 members and 6 alternates. 3 are nominated from our Gwich'in Tribal Council, and they're alternates. And then we have 3 from government, and they're alternates. And through the government side, it's through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Canadian Wildlife Service, or Environment Canada. I think they're called Environment Climate Change Canada now. And the territorial government, the government of Northwest Territories. We do have some vacancies, but it's mostly just due to the appointment process. So a lot of them are in the system, just waiting for the appointments to come through. And the alternates do help in times when we have vacancies. But I guess the other point I wanted to mention is that once the board members are appointed, even though they've been nominated from different organizations, they do act in the public interest, and they're independent once appointed. And I guess the idea is that the organizations that nominate should be nominating good people that will help contribute to the decisions, and that's kind of where the essence of co-management is coming from with the structure of the board. We also have skilled technical staff. We have 3 biologists and a renewable resources manager that do research monitoring and management planning in the communities. And I used to be one of the biologists, and through my time in that role, I kind of delved into all kinds of different positions. I kind of helped with a lot of the different files before moving into the executive director position. So the board has a lot of powers. I'm not going to go into this too much, but to say that as the main instrument for wildlife, fish, and forest management in the Gwich'in Settlement Area, the board does have many powers, as you can see on this slide. But the one I'm here to talk to you today is about its research mandate. So I'll now explain the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board's research priority process. And my goal is to not get too descriptive here on process, but to illustrate that we do have an established process, and that it is really community-based, and it helps the board focus its research mandate. But I think that there's also an opportunity to share some of the information that's collected through that process with researchers, and I think that could be a benefit to them. So the board's research mandate comes from the land claim, where this is my interpretation, but it talks about the board may participate in research. It may have an independent research capability, but it cannot duplicate existing research. So I kind of interpret that as meaning that the board can do research, whether directly, indirectly, but they should be working together with government and other organizations to make sure that they're not doing things that are already being done. So some of the activities that the board is research-related activities that the board is involved in, these all require some type of prioritization to determine the level of involvement. So staff are involved in research, either directly leading the project from design to reporting stage, but they also sometimes research that is led by government or researchers or other organizations. Sometimes the staff just offer assistance on surveys or other forms of in-kind support. And again, that's kind of like depending on what is the board's priority will kind of help determine the level of that involvement. Myself, I write letters of support for researchers. And again, I look at the level of how closely related is that research to our mandate, how closely related is it to the research priorities that the board has, is it related to a management planning process, and also how has that researcher engaged the community, because that's really important to us as well. So the letter would be stronger the more, depending on that level of engagement and relation to our mandate. Can also look at partnerships on priorities that are really high priorities. And then the board does have a small bit of money that it can allocate towards research. So it might just give money to a researcher to do a project. And we also have some money to encourage youth, because that's important to the board too, to try and encourage our young people to get involved in research, and connecting them with researchers doing that work is the goal of that youth work experience money. So the process is basically, we have a workshop every 5 years. We just had our second workshop in September in Aklavik, the one I was mentioning before. And at that workshop is kind of when the board really sets its like long-term research priorities. And they decided to rename it this time to research management needs. But on an ongoing basis, on an annual basis, the staff are actively in the communities, and when you're in a community at a meeting, you might be there to talk about, I don't know, like caribou maybe, or something, or a fish species, but you're going to hear lots of other things. Like, it's not all so, like, everything is kind of connected. So what we try to do is we do have one staff person that's kind of responsible for kind of trying to collate all of those interests that we hear when we're at meetings. And we try to like follow up with the individuals or organizations, the community people that are expressing these research ideas or concerns that they want to see done. And as you can imagine, some of these things like don't even relate to our mandate whatsoever, but we're still collecting that information because we're there and we're hearing it, and it's still important to them. So the data collection is ongoing, and then the board has 2 face-to-face meetings. In the fall, they look at updating their priorities. So at the workshop, they set their long-term priorities, but at the fall meeting, one of the staff will kind of will present if they've heard anything since the last workshop. And the idea is like to try and capture emerging needs. So there could have been something that wasn't thought about at the workshop. And then they make project allocation decisions and determine their work plans at their winter meeting. So that feeds into the discussion that happens in the fall, feeds into the decisions they make in the winter. So that's basically the process. And like I mentioned, in so in Aklavik in September, we held a workshop. The first day was research priorities, and the second day was strategic planning, and the information from the research priority discussions kind of fed into the strategic planning as well. This is a photo of the participants that participated in that workshop, and there is board members, staff, renewable resource councils, community members, and we, through the university, we were able to have a grad student that helped us prepare for this workshop, and he's linked in on Skype, I believe. Jarrett is from Whitehorse, and he did a lot of the preparation work for us, so he did some pre-engagement to help prepare for the workshop. And so don't expect you to kind of read this. The idea is just to give you an idea that this is the type of thing. So it was a working kind of workshop, and the board does have some criteria that they approved in the past that helps them filter. So you can imagine that if you're trying to record everything that you hear in the communities, you can imagine that that list is really long. And sometimes in the past, I've called it a research shopping list, like just really long. And the board obviously only has 6 staff, and we have 3 of them are biologists. But we're a management board, and management planning kind of comes first. And we're not always doing like a lot of research. We do sometimes, but it's not the main focus. So we obviously can't do all of that work. So there has to be a process established so that we can kind of prioritize what does the board provide funding for to other organizations, and what do we want to internalize as top priorities for our staff to work on. So what happened is we had breakout groups, and we had each group had a different criteria, and they rank it, and then we kind of look at it as a collective, and then like try and figure out what are the top ones. So we were able to come up with some top priorities. It needs a little bit more work, and Jared is helping us with that, just to I think the next slide. So I think I mentioned that the name changed from research priorities to research and management needs, and that kind of encompasses the management planning plans that we have in place. But also we're going to, from the work that happened at that workshop, he's helping us kind of look at consistency of the categories, because some are extremely specific. We want research on this fish species in this river and at this location, and looking at this specific topic. But then other ones were like, we just want to know more about fish health. So trying to look at having maybe broad categories with some examples underneath them. And what we hope is that that'll be presented to the board at their February meeting, and the board can approve their priorities going forward. But I guess one of the main things that I kind of wanted to emphasize is that the goal for this process is for the board to set its own priorities, but in the process of that, they do have this regional list that represents research interests that people really want research to be done on. So I see that as the internal process is the board's priorities, but I see the regional list as something that can be shared more broadly, and I do see that as something that perhaps is a gap that I'm sure that there's a lot of researchers or students out there that are interested in doing research in the north, but they're not sure what they should do it on, and what do people actually want work to be done on. So I see this as kind of like a starting point for like helping people understand what people are talking about on the ground in the communities. So try to share this broadly. It is on our website, even the past one. The new one from this past workshop will go on our website after the board approves it in February. But right now we have the existing one that we've been going off of on our website. And I try to share it as much as possible, and I try to do talks like this whenever I can, just to try and help, with the communication. So when the projects that researchers are doing are directly related to the board's mandate, there's a lot of different ways that we can help support that research. And again, it kind of depends on how closely related is it to the mandate and the priorities. But we could develop partnerships, and I'll give an example a little bit later about one of the partnerships we've been able to establish. We could provide financial support. We could help with youth involvement, and in-kind support could mean like staff time, but it also could mean equipment sharing and letters of support and just in general advice. So, but when it's unrelated to the board's mandate, we can still help by sharing contact information with whoever had shared that research interest, and again, providing advice and just like how we should, like best practice advice. So I'll go into best practices, and now that you have an understanding of the board's research priority process and the supports that are available through us, I just wanted to take some time to talk about, share my thoughts on what I think is good advice on best practices. As I mentioned, that I have been in the academic world. When I was in Halifax, I worked for Fisheries and Oceans, and it was very academically driven. I was just a technician at the time, like a summer student or a casual employee, but I remember that, you know, everybody's work plan was driven by how many publications you do, and even myself, I was trying to get on as many papers under the acknowledgement section as possible and put that on my resume. But when I moved home, what I realized pretty quick was that people don't care about publications in the North. What they care about is what you're doing. Are you answering the questions that we have? Like, what is the question I asked and what is the answer? I've also done research myself. So when I was a biologist, I did do, with the board, I did do some research on with fisheries, and I've had some publications myself. So I do have that kind of understanding. But I also have the understanding of what I hear when I'm in the communities and what people are saying. So I guess just want to kind of start that conversation. And that's what I've put a lot of thought into, like, what advice would I give? And this is a visual that I put together to try to visualize my advice. I really truly believe that research that affects the communities should be an ongoing conversation. And I should note that, like, even though this may not happen, it doesn't mean that the research isn't sound research. I'm just saying that I think that there's a lot of value added when you involve the community in a meaningful way. And I think that a lot of the concerns that I hear directly from people could benefit if there was more of an ongoing conversation, is what I call it, not consultation or engagement, but a conversation that is ongoing throughout that process. So I kind of could see it starting with the GRRB's regional interest lists. So somebody who's interested in doing work in the North but not really sure what area, maybe looking at our list and trying to see what maybe perks their interest, and then following up with talking with the community about does this really, so I understand this was your concern, I'm interested in this, does this align, and then work with them about developing your question. And then the design, you can also include them in the design. And I think what's really powerful from communities is, like, you know, they're there, they understand the landscape and, you know, access to areas. So it might be easy to look on a map and say, okay, I'm going to sample in these different areas, but it may be a community person, if you're involving them in that design, they might tell you that, you know, that's somewhere that you're not going to be able to access with a boat, and you're going to have to do something else, and you need to plan for that and budget for that. Or maybe they might say, you know, you're looking at slumps and you're looking at these areas, but did you know that there's some over here too? And or it could be that there's areas that you shouldn't go to for sensitivity or cultural reasons, or that you should go to because they want you to learn more, or they want to understand more about that. And there's just lots of ways that little things could be added to your research that could benefit both. And again, I think that reinforces that conversation. And then the licensing, a lot of times the community's first contact with the researcher is at the licensing stage. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that it could happen before that, and by the time the licensing stage happens, they're going to already know who you are and what you're doing. And looking at the application, it's more of like, okay, does this include what we talked about? And I know the Aurora Research Institute is the organization that licenses research, and they always recommend that researchers apply 3 months in advance before doing your research. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that, but I think that if you're following this kind of a approach, then it might get a quicker response from the community. The reason they say 3 months is because they only meet once a month, and if you've never had that contact, they might have more questions, and it just ends up taking a little bit more time. And then in the methods, including community in the methods, so hiring people to help you while you're out on doing the work, and again, they can help give you input on locations and like things that they know from living in the area. And I think the other part is in the methods, if you're there in the community, the other piece of information I really encourage is to just reach out and like stop by the Renewable Resource Council office, go into the schools if you can, and go to community events. Like sometimes there's dances or different things, and I've been really impressed when I've seen some of the people that I know are doing research in the area, and then I go to a community event and I see them on the dance floor. Like that's like I think one of the objectives or things that I like seeing is like those relationships built, and that's one of the ways you can build that and have fun. And then the analysis, I understand that a lot of times the analysis has to be done away from the community, and then there's usually a big gap from the license and then hiring people and then doing the work, and then there's an analysis. Sometimes it might take a year or two, depending on what you're doing. But I think that conversation can still happen through interim reports, even if you don't have exact results. You can still communicate and check in and keep that conversation going. And then the results, people always tell me they want people to come in the community and present results in person whenever possible. But I recommend that when you do those community presentations that you look at it from what was the question they asked to be answered, and just answer that question. I realize that there needs to be a balance, because I've even been told myself that, where's all your graphs? And I want to see what you did. So they do want to see some of it, but not too much. There's kind of like a balance to be made, and just maybe the most relevant graphs and most relevant maps, and then making sure that you spend time to orientate them on what does this mean before you move on. But definitely plain language, clear when doing results. So into examples. I truly believe that the Rat River Monitoring Program is a really good example of a community-based project. It was initiated by community concerns on that char population declining, and then there was a management regime that was developed that includes community, regional, and national representation, and they meet every year to talk about the char population and make recommendations on how to manage those char. But they also, the basis of those decisions is they're also doing research in the community, and there is like a scientific side where people are, researchers are going into the fishing hole and doing mark and recapture work up there to get an idea of the population. But there's also this long-term char monitoring program where there's people that are Gwich'in from the communities that have traditional camps along the char migration route, and they would have been going to their camps anyways to get the char for their personal use. And what we did is, when I say we, the organizations that are involved in the management, we looked at establishing this monitoring program with these individuals that are going to be going to their camps anyways, and teaching them how to sample the char that are coming through and doing catch per unit effort. And it helps to provide observations of the char population, and if you look at the graphs from the monitoring program and the graphs from the mark and recapture data, they're closely aligned. So it's a really strong indicator of when the population is doing well. And I guess the other thing that I really like about this project and this program is that just the whole management of it works is it's another example, I think, of when community is involved. I might have another slide. Yeah. So when it was initiated by the community, there's a strong partnership between the different organizations. The community is collecting the data. The picture in the last slide and this slide is John Carmichael. He's the head char monitor that is part of this program. And the data set is long term, so you can look at consistencies in the data and trends, and it's a good example of when traditional knowledge and science are coming together. And the information feeds into a decision-making process that includes community, regional organizations like our board, but also national organizations like the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and it's over 2 land claim areas, the Gwich'in and the Inuvialuit, so we're working amongst 2 different jurisdictions. And because communities involved at all the different stages, in times when the population has gone down, they have made decisions to voluntarily close harvest, and there is high compliance with those recommendations. And I think it's because you have that level of community involvement and buy-in, and they're helping be advocates to encourage people not to harvest during those times. So then this is the other example that I have is this muskrat project, and I think it's a really interesting story to tell. Is one of my staff, she's the one that kind of compiles all of the research interests, and she was on the plane going somewhere, I don't know where, I forget, but she happened to sit next to this guy, and he is a researcher studying muskrats in Old Crow. He was doing his graduate work there, and she heard what he was doing, was like, wow, like we have this research interest, like people want muskrat work done in our area. And she convinced them to come to Inuvik and give a presentation. And from that, we developed this partnership. And even though he's external, and this wasn't even part of his graduate work. His graduate work was with Old Crow. He just started to develop this project. And then the word got around, and then there was another woman that was doing more like traditional knowledge on muskrat, and she tapped into it, and the 2 of them started doing research proposals and working with our board, and we developed a partnership where the money kind of comes through us, and we're administering and managing, but then they're doing like the work with the community. And I think it's a really good example of partnership. And I remember Jeremy and Shanda, their names, they came to a GRRB meeting, and I remember them sitting down in front of our board, and our board meetings always have community people. We bring the renewable resource councils into our meeting, and went over the questions and said, here's what I understand your question to be, and here's how I am planning to answer these questions. Did I get it right? And I thought that was really important, because like he took that time, and not just over the phone, he came in person to do that. And he kind of like changed, like looked at the design based on that. And then when he comes to the community, I was sitting with him in my, like Jeremy, in my office just last week, and he's in Inuvik for 4 weeks now. And I think like just kind of thinking about, being in the community, like planning to be there and working with people, establishing your name and working with them, and like schedules change, like you can have everything planned and then something can happen and it just changes everything. So you might think that you can come in, fly in on a Monday, do the meeting on a Tuesday, fly out on a Wednesday, and maybe it might work, but yeah. And also, I think when both of them are in the communities, like both of them are now done their graduate work, and Shanda's working for Inuvialuit in Inuvik, and Jeremy's working for Environment Canada, but he's still doing some of this muskrat work. And when they come into the communities, they do go into the schools, and I think Jeremy's done some necropsies with the students, and so I just think that it's like a good example of somebody that it just kind of came from our research interests and just like a conversation on a plane, and then developed this partnership. And I think they are really trying to, make that relationship work at the community level. So in summary, some of the just main points is, work with the community at all stages, be inclusive. They can help keep the project grounded and aligned with the research interests that they're interested in, and in turn that can help build your reputation with them, and they're going to be more willing to want to work and help and offer advice too. And I think like one of the challenges I've noticed with some of the people that talk to me, researchers, is that they don't know who to talk to. And then if you take the time to like if you're working on your project and you're looking at the way that I'm suggesting, then you're going to be building those relationships, and those people are in turn going to help feed into giving you advice, and that kind of helps like with your project, and it might even help save time. So you might be thinking about doing a component of your project that requires ground truthing something when people already know that, and then you might be able to like save money too. So again, I think relationships is really important, and then spending time in the communities. So like I was mentioning, like how some of those researchers were going into the schools or attending community events, just being there and visual and like willing to talk with people, I think is important too. And I think when people do that, what I hear sometimes the researchers saying is that they also are starting to hear the interest from the people. They start talking, and then they hear different things, and then that gets their minds going of different ways they can take projects and things like that, or make other connections. And then I think just answering the question, like not complicating things. I know it's really easy when you're working with something day in and day out to get into the details, but I think that what community really wants to know is what was the question and what's the answer to that question. And like I mentioned, like graphs are okay and maps, but just maybe make sure that they relate to the question, and be as clear as possible using plain language, and just answer the question. And then I think that how do you know if you're doing a good job? I think that if you're at a meeting and you're noticing that people are showing up to your meeting, for one, I think that just because they don't show up doesn't mean it's not good, but if they do show up, you know that you got the word out, you're communicating, you know, and you can tell that they're engaged and listening to what you have to say. You can see that in the when you're talking with them, and they're asking questions, and people are taking the time to understand who you are and what you want to accomplish, then you know that you're getting to them too. And decisions need to include all the best information, because getting more information, those decisions are strengthened. So if you see them, like organizations like mine, using the research that you're doing into the decision-making processes, then I think that's good too. And when you are having meetings and you know, sometimes like people aren't happy about things that are happening, and the work that you're doing might trigger some thoughts from them, and then you get like some pretty hard questions or things like that. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. I actually sometimes think it's a good thing, because they feel comfortable enough to share that with you. And maybe there's ways that you can kind of try and help connect people to help with those questions. But when you are able to have a meeting and there's a positive environment and laughter and people are talking with you afterwards, I think that that shows that you're doing a pretty good job, and they'll probably tell you too. This is a picture from the GRRB. Like, we do a lot of work in the communities. This is a picture from that workshop again, and a breakout session. And again, I think like it's important to say that there's board members, staff, and community members, and renewable resources councils all sitting together and talking, everybody at the same level, and just having plain conversations. And they did give us like some recommendations of things that they want us to do differently, but it wasn't in a negative way. There's a lot of laughter and a lot of positive conversations, and just saying like, you know, you're doing this good, but you know, we need to think about this too. And I think that that to me shows that I think the board is doing a pretty good job at working with the communities. So just to end, the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board is a good example of co-management in the north. We have an established process for research, and the regional lists that could be a starting point for researchers that are interested in doing research in the north, in our region in particular. And the GRRB could provide support for researchers that are doing work that is related to one of our priorities. And just in general, listen and work with the community, plan and budget accordingly, and then that the value is added to research that has an ongoing relationship with the community. So I'm just doing a check-in. I hope that I've kind of touched on these points, that my goal is to try and encourage more meaningful research that kind of connects the interests that are being talked about at the community level with the broader research community, and help find ways that we can bridge that gap and be the voice for things that I hear on the ground and have experienced myself, and inform researchers of existing processes. So I hope that I've accomplished that with what I've talked to you about this evening. Just to end, I just wanted to thank the organizers. Thanks, Elaine, for asking me to talk this evening. And I think I'm always willing to talk about this kind of stuff if anybody wants to reach out to me. So I hope that you enjoyed my talk, and Hai Cho, Masi Cho, thank you.